Hello, everyone. Welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. I am your host, as always, James W. Jesso. If you're watching this on YouTube, you'll have to forgive my casual attire. I'm actually sitting here in my living room next to my plant. I've only got two. That's one of them. And it's New Year's Eve, the day that I'm recording this, so I've been pretty chill. I'll be doing my shower and dress process sometime a little bit later before heading out for some Gregorian celebrations. This episode, which is definitely releasing in the new year, is the first episode of 2019, and it is number 90. The people who are on this episode have chosen to remain anonymous, as each of them are licensed therapists who are also providing underground psychedelic therapy. Because they would like to remain anonymous, each of the guests is going by a false name. Those names will be introduced at the very beginning of the interview. But also, I needed to basically scramble and change up the audio in order for their voices not to be recognized. This comes with the unfortunate consequence of you really needing to attend in order to hear everything that's being said, as the modulation of the voice, in addition to the quality of a Skype call, leans to being able to be understood, but certain inflections being lost if not attended to in a very, conscious way, or at least mostly conscious way, which that plus some other issues. I haven't recorded three people on Skype at the same time. And so there were a few problems that came up here and there with audio echoing and glitching out and stuff. And I've done pretty extensive work on the post-production side of things to make sure that you don't notice that was the case. But for the most part, it's good. You will notice a couple unfortunate errors with the audio. But given what you were about to receive, I really felt like it was much better to release it with a bit of a strange audio than to not release it at all, which at the end of this episode, I am sure you will understand why. One final thing about the content of this episode: it can be kind of easy to get lost with who's speaking when they're not directly using each other's pseudonyms to speak to each other or respond to each other, because the voices are all now sort of pretty similar due to having been modified. In order to address this, on the YouTube video, I've taken the extra effort to make sure that there is an orange square that isolates who's talking at any given time, given that you also can't see their mouths moving because they have little things put over their faces that appropriately match their chosen pseudonyms. Those are the only sort of pre-thought things to throw into this episode. You can pretty much assume what this episode's going to be about. It is a conversation between me and three underground psychedelic therapists about providing psychedelic therapy and the context or how to address certain things when they arise, and what psychedelic psychotherapy can be good for, and what substances to use in what context, and in-depth investigation into their different methodologies on various aspects of the experience. And one that I think is important for all of us to know, because psychedelic psychotherapy is really huge, and whether you are going to be providing one legitimately, or you are already providing therapy with, basically illegally now, or if you are just a psychedelic enthusiast yourself, or someone who wants to become a sitter, which is different than being a therapist. I think that what is present in this episode and in the wisdom of these three women, all from Canada, is really incredible. And I'm really happy to have really happy to have basically brought this episode together. And I hope that you enjoy it. Before the interviews actually begin, I'm going to send a huge thanks to my patrons on Pateron, especially the people whose names are listed on the screen here on YouTube, or in the description to this episode on jameswjesso.com, or other places that this podcast is hosted, such as Spotify, which is now available on Spotify for anyone interested. Big thanks to them. And of course, Thanks to anyone that is leaving one-time PayPal or crypto donations. This podcast exists because of the voluntary support of the people who are appreciating it, like yourself. So if you would like to donate to the podcast and support what you're getting when you tune in, you can do so by heading to jameswjesso.com/support, where you can see all the options of doing so, which include Patreon, PayPal, crypto, buying t-shirts, buying other merch online, art, buying lectures, my books. Basically, there's a variety of options for you to support me and the podcast here, and it's all at jameswjesso.com/support. So thank you very much for doing so. Okay, that's it. Thank you, and enjoy this episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Pikachu, Tooth Fairy, and Jules, welcome to Adventures Through the Mind. We've had a little bit of a hard run getting set up for today, and we are months into the process of planning this. So why don't we start off with a general question that's going to go out to each of you, which is, what exactly do you do? In that sense, what kind of therapy are you providing? Is it directive or non-directive? Is it more in a shamanic camp? Do you have one or two people with you? And what substances are you using?
So, James, I'm going to answer your question in an unorthodox way. What I'm providing for people is care from my heart. And there are a lot of techniques I use to do that, but ultimately, what I'm providing is presence and care from my heart. That's how I answer that question. And outside of my psychedelic medicine, I do somatic relational trauma-informed consulting. And then when I do psychedelic therapy, I use MDMA, 3-MMC, and now I've introduced psilocybin as well. And I could probably talk long and hard about how I do that, but to me the essence of it is being in relationship, being moment to moment, coming from the heart, and connecting as human beings, and meeting a person where they're at, and meeting them with everything that comes on. This polyvagal theory is a very important umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll come in next. Does this sound good here?
Yep, go ahead.
So I've been a counselor for over 30 years, and when I found psychedelics, I was so impressed by how effective they are. And I agree with, sort of the tenet that sessions of psychedelics is worth 2 or 3 years of talk therapy. And I also have found that using psychedelics gets into areas that really talk therapy cannot get into. It's that default mode system is just too well established. So I agree. It's about working with the heart and turning up for people and using a new technology that's extremely effective.
Okay, I'll go next here. So I do therapy, other than medicine work as well, but I do see a lot of people for integration work. If people have had their own practices or other experiences with various different medicines. So that can look, and even the psychedelic work as well, can look like existential work, transpersonal work, relational work in terms of psychodynamic aspects, and some body-based work as well. So instead of just talk therapy, getting people to connect with their bodies or deeper levels of processing, and definitely with medicine work that is similar to what was said already around companioning people and sometimes redoing particular attachment wounds that happen, because that's definitely one of my biases around why people come to any kind of therapy, is because they need sort of a reworking of kind of some of their basic core beliefs about themselves and how they can be in relationship to other people. And the two medicines that I have worked with primarily are MDMA and psilocybin. But I find also too that just sometimes, really good psychotherapy can, be as effective as medicine work, but medicine work has its own sort of special category as well.
So this next question is actually, before we go there, do you find that now you're working with different substances? I know Tooth Fairy, you said MDMA and 3-MMC, which understandably have like a fairly similar sort of phenomenological effect on the person, compared to, say, MDMA and psilocybin can be quite different. For each of you, when you work with different substances, does your methodology shift, and how so for each one?
Are you asking the methodology as you're working with it, or how you get to choosing which one you're working with?
Ooh, now that's a great clarification. Why don't we start? We'll answer both. Why don't you start with how you get to the point of saying, okay, MDMA, not psilocybin, or vice versa, and then after we do a round of that, then we'll find out. We'll ask what the differences are in methodology during.
Mm-hmm. Well, so for me, it's such an intuitive process sometimes, and I check in for months in advance. Um, when I talk to clients, sometimes I might even say to them, "Hey, I don't know if it's going to be 3-MMC or MDMA about a week before," and I'm always in communication with them. And what it comes down to is what's the most predominant wound that's coming up right now. MDMA is a relational medicine. It's a heart-based medicine, and we all have relational wounds. We all have that at the core. And when I'm focusing on a very specific trauma, one that has been overshadowing someone's life for a long time, an encapsulated trauma, and it's like it seems to affect everything else, then I go towards the 3-MMC, or if there are secrets that have been locked so deep inside that they have not been able to share with anyone, I'll go more towards the 3-MMC. So that's how I choose that. With the psilocybin, I know psilocybin very well for myself over years of recreational use, but in terms of working with it as a medicine, I started to work with a client with, and I'm going to say this loosely, an eating disorder, because it's never an eating disorder, it's just called that, but it's really, it's deep trauma in the womb. I decided on psilocybin with her, and it's so hard to really articulate why, James, but I had a sense that we needed to go very deep internally into a holding place, a place where she could experience physically the shame that has overshadowed her entire life. So it's so hard to actually say why. These are just speculations. These are really just learning the medicine over time. And I have to say that a lot of the times I go with my gut and a lot of contemplation and a lot of conversations back and forth with the client until one day I wake up and I go, it's this one. And I say to them, hey, I'm going to say this word to you, MDMA. How does that feel for you right now? Mm. So it's a cocktail. It's really a cocktail of how I get there. Mm. There are no hard, fast rules about it for me.
Yeah, I think I agree with the Tooth Fairy. I think my methodology is to meet with people at least 3 times before the session. More would be better. And I like them to come in informed, so I always ask them to do lots of reading, listen to podcasts, yours included. And so I would say the methodology is more of a consensus rather than me saying, I will give advice. I will say, okay, my sense is MDMA is a better one for you rather than psilocybin, but I like it really to be a consensus. And one of the differences I find between MDMA and psilocybin, I would say, is MDMA or 3-MMC is so excellent for
trauma. To me, it's sort of like a laser. It just goes right in to where people need to be, whereas psilocybin I find to be a more integrative kind of process. And so for transpersonal kinds of explorations, I would definitely say, psilocybin might be a better choice. I think the difference is that, what I've noticed is I call things like psilocybin embodied molecules, that my sense is there's kind of a wisdom there that is not necessarily there with the human-made molecules. So I kind of talk to people about that as well.
And I'm sorry to jump in, but I was wanted to just say that if someone's coming to me for an ecstatic experience, or they want to have some big, incredible insight, that for me is a little red flag, and that's when I say to them, okay, let's actually take a look. What's at the root of you not wanting to experience what's actually happening for you? I just wanted to put that in there. So I've actually dissuaded some people from doing psilocybin, a client with bipolar, because I actually wanted to get down to what was happening for him in relationship with his family. So I worked with MDMA. I just wanted to toss that in while I remembered.
It's often a good introduction. I will absolutely agree with you on that. I see 3MMC as sort of clearing the way, and very good for biographical material.
Things I'd add probably is, if clients' history, if they're sort of novice in terms of their own use, that might be part of the conversation as well, just around kind of expectations, and then also, for MDMA and potentially other things beyond psilocybin, just looking at any physiological contraindications too, if someone has any kind of cardiovascular heart issues, anything like that, I would really caution me. Or if there's any other sort of health issues or anything like that too, sometimes that can be a factor just around even length of time, how long things last, and just that kind of suitability too. But I'd agree as well that it's kind of a collaborative sort of decision making of coming down to which medicine.
So moving into the next question, how does how you show up different for, say, psilocybin compared to, I mean, it seems like what we're talking about here is a pretty clear defined somewhere between MDMA and psilocybin. So the entactogens versus the classical psychedelics, like how is it different for you in how you show up and in how you facilitate the actual therapeutic session during the drug trial, the drug session?
Well, first of all, I show up. I just got to show up. I show up so completely for anything that you're working with, anything that I'm working with. Because I facilitated more with MDMA and 3MMC, I find with the MDMA and 3MMC, there's a lot of real focused working. I find for me it's a focused work period, and really listening to each moment that's being dropped and then interacting with that. There's a lot of interaction that way for me, and also really paying attention to when a client is going internal and giving space for that client to go internal, and then just in those gentlest moments just to check in with the client to see if they want to come back out and work through something or complete something. So I find for me, I have found it more interactive, the 3MMC and MDMA, than psilocybin. And what I've found really interesting in the times that I've worked with psilocybin with a client is the amount of times that I've actually begun to experience what they were experiencing. So, for example, this client that I worked with, who was really marinating in shame, and I want to say that marinating, there was so much shame in her body that she could not even hold it. And when I was working with her on psilocybin, it came into my body, and I spontaneously began to shake, and I'd never had that experience before. I wasn't afraid of it, and I said to her, I'm not afraid of what's happening right now. I'm just going to help your body process some of this. So the twice that I've worked with her, I've actually taken on some of what she was experiencing to help the load. So I found that very interesting because I've never experienced anything like that. I've heard about it before. So it was well, both a very somatic level working for me, but that had a real experience of sharing the load and letting her see it.
I've had that experience as well, Tooth Fairy, and yeah, I find showing up for both of those, I'm often on a very similar journey as they are, and we share afterwards, and often we have had similar experiences. To go back to your question, James, they as a psychedelic psychotherapist, I have noticed that those are definitely different, and I think they do need different kinds of support. The empathogens, because they often, especially in the descent, have kind of a speediness to them. I find I have to kind of encourage people to stay interior as long as they can, because they sometimes just that kind of speediness of the substance, they start talking too soon, and they want to talk and talk and talk, and sometimes I'll have to say, or I feel I need to say, can you just be quiet a little bit longer, stay in a little bit longer. We'll have lots of time, to integrate and process this. I would say with, as you said, the classical psychedelics, I probably more of my support is somatically, just holding them, and always with permission. And so I think my methodology is maybe a little bit different. But of course, just turning up for whatever they need. And different people their responses are so incredibly unique. People I think are going to be just, curling up in a blanket for 2-3 hours. That's one response, and all the way to people yelling and screaming for 3 to 4 hours and thrashing about. So it's a very, very unique response to both of those.
For me, just knowing too that for MDMA, there's a lot more people wanting to have their own empathy sort of directed towards the therapist, and so there's more opportunities to kind of have that level of relational work done, I think, as opposed to psilocybin, where they're kind of in a little bit more of their own, altered state, or kind of maybe mystical experience, or just something that's, kind of that real sort of psychedelic kind of state. So that's probably just something that I've noticed just around, kind of people staying inward a little bit more. But I think that's always the balance too, is, how much do you encourage people to stay inward, which regardless of the medicine, and just kind of have, go inward and go, really connect with themselves. But sometimes people also want to connect and, reach out to another human that's supporting them there. So it's always a really big balance. So sometimes even I think about it, and it's like, yes, the medicine is one piece, but even just the combination of people that show up and the therapist styles and just your amount of, kind of engaging versus kind of letting the process happen is a really big thing. The other thing too that I think of as well is people have different decisions, therapists have different decisions around whether or not to partake in a smaller amount of the medicine themselves, and that's something that I've kind of experimented with too. And for my decision is to be very clear and not be in any kind of medicine, because I find just working with people in that place, it's enough of an altered state for me, just companioning folks like that. But I know that that's not everybody's practice as well, so just thought of that as well as you guys were speaking.
Is that something, Jules or Tooth Fairy, you'd like to speak on? This concept of maybe having a little bit to put yourself on the level. Is that something that you include in your practice? And if so or not, why?
Hmm. Well, I do like to use a little bit when I'm working with a client because for me, I find that I connect with them on that level. I find that the clients generally like to know that they're not alone on the medicine, the ones that I work with anyway. And in a way, what that requires of me is that I keep doing my work throughout, my own work in between the medicine sessions, so that I'm not doing my work in the medicine session. So in a way, it disciplines me to make sure I've taken care of myself, so that when I'm in the session, stuff isn't coming up for me on the medicine. I do find that I personally can connect better with the client. I've had that feedback from clients towards me, that they found that I was really there with them and really understood what they were feeling, really got what they were sensing. So, and sometimes with psilocybin, I'll do a microdose of it. That's my personal way of working with it. That might change. Right now, that's the way I like to do it. And for me, it does deepen the experience. That's what I was feeling. At the same time, I have no issue if the co-therapist that I'm working with doesn't want to partake, and I've worked in that way many times. I have no issue with that, and it's a beautiful mix that comes up.
Yeah, it clearly is an individual choice of the therapist, and I have tried both. I think right now what I go with is more sort of like the Groff model. I've been trained by people who were trained by Groff, and I like to go in absolutely sober. Um, I find I'm empathetic enough that I'm with them, like I'm with them on the journey, and there is, I think, a kind of a security that they know I'm sober, I'm clean and sober, and I think that is an anchor for them in terms of, if any, just sort of, if anything happened, they would know I would be there and I would be able to, look after them and cope with whatever is coming up. But as you, Tooth Fairy, I mean, sometimes my sitters like to take a little bit, sort of like a microdose, and I certainly, don't stop them. I understand that as a way as well.
So I'm gonna direct this next question. It's directed towards all of you, but we'll just start with Pikachu because just because that feels like the right flow. You mentioned now co-therapist, and also Jules, you mentioned sitter. What is the actual structure of people in the space? Is it you one-on-one? Is it you with a co-therapist? Is it you with a sitter? Who's that sitter? Who's that sitter to you? Who's that sitter to the other person? If you could just speak on the actual sort of social structure of who's in the room, that'd be great.
So my experiences have been quite different, mostly one-on-one. I really actually prefer the co-therapist model. I think there's just so much that can happen with that, and people can kind of bounce off two individuals supporting them. Whether that's another same sex or different male female or anything like that. But that's just not always possible in terms of what you have to put together with it too. The other thing that I've done as well is have an individual who is not partaking in the medicine and is not a therapist, but is a supporter to the individual who is in the session, which can also be helpful too. It sort of depends on, the individual dynamics and things like that as well, but just to have an additional person who's been part of the pre-work and the preparation and things like that, and so it's just one other person to be there for that individual as well. So and I find for sure, like, now I'm still learning around how I want to do this and what works best and whatnot too. But if I could have sort of my preference for the future, would be two therapists model, because I think there's just a lot of potential around reworking some of those early family pieces.
two different models. Certainly, I think ideally two therapists is better, because family systems can come up certainly during therapy, as well as archetypes, the male archetype, the female archetype, and that can be a beautiful thing. Regression is something that often happens with psychedelics. So being able to have mom and dad there is absolutely wonderful. I would say that the drawback of that is expense, in that I have to pay for myself and a male sitter as well. So I do, maybe to go back to your first question, James, I do individual sitting, and I also do group sessions as well. And I like to start with individual, and then people, I will invite them to a group. And those dynamics are different. I love groups because there's so much really great sharing that can go on before and after. I mean, I would think during the ascent and peak period, I think people are pretty interior. So yeah, I do both.
So again, for me, where I am in my life, in my thinking, and my way of being, I'm not thinking about what's best or what's not best. I'm thinking about what might be optimal for a client, for a particular client, what might be optimal for a particular situation. And that changes for me, and I'm a bit more fluid about that right now. I have had extraordinary experiences with co-therapists where I thought I just can't wait to work with you again, and Pikachu and I have gotten to work together, and that was an extraordinary experience that I would love to partake in again. But for me, again, I work very intuitively. Because I come from theater, I've often had to cast people in plays, and I've had to pick the right person for the right part. And for me, it's a very similar process. So when I have a client, I think, what's the right casting for this situation? And when I really follow that from a deep gut level, I think to myself, how about these three people in a room right now together? Or I might think, when I'm doing groups, I always do it by invite only, and it's always clients that I've worked with. If I get a referral, I'm going to be very, very careful and ask that person to work with me for a little bit. So I cast groups. And what I mean by that is I think about how this person would interact with this person, with that other person, to make a really strong cast, a cast of safety. And and also, when I think about certain people that I work with, sometimes my sense is that this one particular client needs someone to be with them one-on-one, to have an experience of my full attention with them through the whole process, because they've never had that kind of undivided attention. For example, a woman that I was working with who was quite severely abused by her mother. It was she's 68, and it was her first experience of being in a room with a woman and not scared. Mm-hmm. And she said, this is the first time I've ever relaxed beside another human being. And I thought, for her, it would have blown her circuits to have three people in the room. It was enough. And she knew. She says, I just want you. I said, thank you for letting me know, because I was letting her know about other awesome therapists that could join. And she said, no, I just want one person. I said, great. Thank you for telling me what you want. And there's some other clients where I suggest, hey, there's this they might have very difficult experiences with fathers, and I say, I'll say to them, I'll suggest, I wonder what it would be like for you to experience a gentle man. Mm-hmm. So then I'll call in a colleague in another province and fly them in, if the client can afford it, so that they can have an experience of a gentle man. So again, it is really such an improvisation, and it's a moment-by-moment feeling into it, and it's a casting, and I don't like to have rules about this. And what's good for one situation isn't optimal for the next situation. Mm-hmm. And the other thing is I lead group retreats, female retreats for women, retreats for men, and what I always love to do is have one man present for the women's retreat and one woman, me, present for the men's retreat. Because that really, it's a different dynamic because we always think, oh, women's retreat, but what's it like to have someone, because we all have a male aspect, we all have a female aspect, and we all have issues with our parents. So I think it creates a very different dynamic to say a women's retreat with a male in the room.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think for clients who are resolving trauma, and especially sexual trauma, male or female, it is, if they're ready for it, and they're not always ready for it at the beginning, but with permission to bring in the same, so if it's a woman who's been abused by a man, to have a male sitter is an incredible experience for them. And they can interact with that male sitter in different ways. It may be that they want to be held. It may be that they want to resist them, somatically. So I'll set up a resisting posture. And that might be what they need to do, is yell and scream and really, sort of complete that kind of trauma response of no, 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 that they couldn't do, when they were 6 years old. So, yeah, I agree with you. I like your idea of casting tooth fairy. I think that's a lovely term.
Mm-hmm. And if I may just add something, thank you, Jules. One thing I wanted to add as well, I had a client who is both a client and a friend, and she specifically asked for my husband to be present in the room. I thought, fantastic, what a brilliant idea. My husband is a very gentle, soft, he does he do this work all the time? No. Has he experienced it? No. Has he sat with the medicine? Yes. Could I trust him to hold a space in the room? And I said to him, don't do anything. If she speaks to you, respond. I'm leading. I was very clear with him on that. And he sat there with his hands open, just holding the most beautiful, compassionate space. And that's what she needed. This female client needed to know there was a male that was holding a compassionate space for her. And he was moving his hands and whatever he was moving energy, and I trusted that. And she trusted that, and that was an experience for her. So I really love the idea that we're discovering it as we go along. What is needed specifically for each session, each client, and that might change from session to session for clients as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a client specifically request my husband as well, because he's also a therapist, and after pushing up and resisting and yelling at him, for, 15-20 minutes, she finally relaxed, and she took off her eye shades, and she said, it's a good thing I like you. because she knew him, she was able to do this.
So I'm gonna shift the conversation ever so slightly, and again, I'm gonna ask Pikachu to start, just because I'm noticing who's getting to speak more, and I'm wanting to definitely focus as much equality of opportunity to speak. So I'll start with you, Pikachu. What do you do when somebody goes into a heightened state? I don't mean just high. I mean like they're in a high anxiety state. They're in a state that in the recreational zone we might call, in a bad trip. What happens when somebody gets to a place where they are now overwhelmed by panic or fear? Maybe they're having an anxiety attack. Maybe they're having a bolt response. They want to get the hell out of there. What do you do when things get really, really heightened? How do you help people calm down? What are some of the things that you've seen and that you've seen have helped?
Well, one of the things you don't do is tell them to calm the fuck down. But it's interesting. I think too. There's a couple things that I want to say about that, because obviously, you know that I've worked lots in kind of the more crisis response side of this, and it's really interesting because I haven't found as many of these kind of reactions in the therapeutic side of it, because there's so much care taken in terms of structuring it and building it and getting to know somebody. Like, so my answer is about the pre-work that needs to happen. So, and I would say to people too, like, if you're ever looking to do this work with anyone, finding an underground therapist, and if somebody says, oh great, yeah, well, come tomorrow and we'll do it. I would run as fast as I could the other way because somebody hasn't taken the time to get to know you and what you're coming in with, the things that might, sort of trigger you, the things that might be kind of your sort of sticky pieces that could cause potential escalation, right? And so I think too, like I've talked to people in advance as well around like my job is to make sure that you're safe, and the pieces of safety is not just psychological safety, but physical safety. Do people have do they live somewhere where there's other people around? I'm going to make sure that they're not going to leave the session. That there's nothing around sort of some of those safety considerations ahead of time. And I think most people, are really, they want to kind of, make the best use of it type of thing. And so if there's somebody that starts to have a particular reaction, and like it's you work with it, you go with it, and it's not a matter of like say in other settings, at a festival or something like that, where sometimes the behaviors like they're just not conducive to the environment. But if somebody needs to yell or scream, like that's been said, helping to kind of work that out and like allowing them, giving them permission sometimes too. If there's some kind of physiological piece that's happening and they're getting, really panicked or something like that, then, I would offer, just being able to remember that they can go back into their body. And sometimes really basic things like just, remembering that they have a body, getting them to focus on their breath or offering a hand or something really pretty small can go a long way. And two, the other piece that I think is really important is really, providing that sort of scaffolding around them where no matter what happens, I'm taking care of myself, so whatever they need to process through, I'm good with. Like I'm not going to tell you to shush, or I'm not going to tell you to, that you can't do this thing, kind of within reason, right? Too, but that, whatever it is, like I'm there for you. Like let's play around with that and use this as an opportunity because obviously it's something that needs to kind of move up and out.
I think I agree with you that the best way to deal with sort of what you were calling bad trips, James, is prevention first. Setting the therapeutic relationship, coming in informed, getting some idea of their attachment style, getting some idea of maybe some attachment disruption, and where if trauma is the issue, what is the where is that trauma likely to take them? I think we've probably all developed some strategies for preventing or rescuing from, let's say, a bad trip. I find somatic support is one of the best ways to go, and to sort of catch that before it gets into the panic stage. So if I see somebody starting to get distressed, I use a technique called healing touch, which is just holding them somatically in some key places along the body, and just holding them and with permission, and that seems to work. That seems to work really well, and I can say I've never had anybody go full into a bum trip yet. So maybe, it's set and setting and all those other things I was talking about that make up the therapeutic relationship.
So I agree with everything that Pikachu and Jules says. And what I teach all my clients, whether they're going to do medicine work or not, I really love Sharon Stanley's model around optimal arousal, high arousal, hyperarousal, and low arousal and hypoarousal, and to really teach clients how to stay not in the window of tolerance, but in optimal arousal, even when we're working. So clients are the clients I work with are very well versed in that to begin with. So I teach them those first signs of somatic arousal, and we don't make it bad. And what we do is we learn how to stay within that, to stay in the optimal arousal to process something. things that I might use in sessions, or what if I notice that someone's dissociating, leaving their body. I've got sandbags. I've got a beautiful little doorstop from Greece in the shape of a lamb that I might put on someone's chest. I mean, there are a lot of things in this room. I'll ask them to, are they comfortable taking my hand? Let's hold on together. What else might I use? Toning is another one. So I've noticed sometimes instead of going into, hyper arousal with screaming, which can sometimes, Sharon Stanley talks about this. Sometimes we have to be very careful about when we complete responses, because sometimes they can reinforce a hyperarousal. So sometimes what I might do is ask a client to go into toning, where we make a really nice tone together, and it still has the same effect without going into that kind of shrieking place. So, and then it really teaches them how to self-regulate, and that's a huge one. And I talk about that a lot when I'm working with clients, is how do you self-regulate? And in our work together, we're mindful of that, right? So I choose those completion responses very, very carefully, especially if I know if the client has sort of a more aggressive type pattern. So I might get them to, clench their hands and really slowly open up the fist rather than scream. And it's just, I make invitations, and always, and I'll just make an invitation and say, hey, are you up for trying this? If it's a no, then it's a no.
One other thing just to add in there as well is, saying to people that, whatever happens for you, yeah, I agree with it, not making it bad or making it a problem or something like that to be, moved around or whatnot, is saying, if you decide to, part of you decides to kind of go out for a little while, and I think a lot of people fear like the lack of control, I'm going to lose control or whatnot too, but just saying, I'm going to be with you the whole time, and I'm going to be here when you come back, and that's totally okay. So again, just a lot of permission and being really regulated in my own body, so I'm not sort of sending out any covert or overt discomforts. At the same time, still being genuine and not being totally flat and so neutral that they don't know what's going on too, right?
And also, Pikachu, what's really important, something about you're saying around that, is that, especially for MDMA, is if a client is picking up on something in you, to answer honestly is so important. When a client says, oh, I'm noticing that you might be nervous, then answer that honestly and say, hey, yeah, I am noticing that. Thank you for noticing, so that the person isn't crazy. They don't feel like they're crazy and they're picking up on stuff. So it's so important to address what's really happening in the relationship in the moment, which is a safety in itself, because so many times we as children may have asked our parents, are you angry with me? Are you disappointed? Is something wrong? And we got a no, and we knew there was something brewing under the surface.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you were talking about, Tooth Fairy, goes along with somatic experiencing in terms of titration, that there is this balance around how much trauma you can resolve, or how much intensity you can sort of experience without re-traumatizing, because that's what we don't want to do, for sure. And I know, James, you've talked about some traumatic psychedelic experiences, so that is what we are trying to prevent. That maybe you touch into that intensity as much as you can sort of handle in terms of integrating, but if it's becoming overwhelming, then I think it's safe to say all of us have techniques to help you titrate that, so that, that's a term which means you don't have to do it all in one session. We can do this, we can work on this particular intensity and integrating it. Maybe it's going to take you a couple of years, to really integrate what's coming up for you right now. I'm seeing nods from everybody.
So I'm gonna shift a little bit and ask a very pointed question about a specific type of client. One of the things that is, there's a few big themes that's coming up around what psychedelic therapy can help. One of them is trauma, another one is depression, and then the other one is death-related existential anxiety and depression. And so my question for you is if any of you have worked with someone who's in their dying time, and what are some of the particular, challenges that are presented in working with somebody who is going in to address that at that time in their life?
Yeah, and James, I read that question. It's interesting because even though I've, kind of had some specialization in kind of the death and dying sort of themes, I haven't specifically been a therapist for somebody who has, is at a later stage and, getting closer to their, if they have something that's more a palliative kind of situation. And I think it's important work. Theoretically, I can tell you all about it, sort of thing, right? Too. And yes, there's those existential concerns for everybody, but I think there's definitely it calls to mind a lot of really important ethical considerations, and again, kind of the physiological potential complications if somebody has some pre-existing stuff, as they're moving towards the end of their life. So, but that's in terms of my own personal experience. That's all my sort of specific work about that.
Yeah, I haven't worked directly in a hospice sort of situation. I would absolutely love to. However, I will say that the death anxiety can come up for anyone in any session. And in fact, I think where I've seen most death anxiety is in young males. And so they're not, like physically close to death, but it's a huge concern for them, and the psychedelic session will often take them through the death experience, which if they can travel through that, can be incredibly liberating.
Mm-hmm. So I haven't worked with any clients with psychedelic medicine. These certainly clients outside of psychedelic medicine who are dying, and I've been at the deathbed of clients as they actually pass away, as they actually die. But the one experience that I did have with a client, it was a teen, it was a boy. He was a boy. I mean, they're still boy, but he wasn't a man yet. And again, his mother was present for the session. And he witnessed his own death, and he dove down, and he had trauma at birth, where he nearly died, and we actually orchestrated him going through his own death and coming up through it, because he had such a deep fear of living, and he was already quite addicted by the time he was 16, and he dove down, met his death, and came up, and it was like diving down in water and coming back up. And at the end of it, I said, "How did you do it?" And he said, what did he say? I pushed through. He said, I was able to push through that. And so it was quite an extraordinary thing to witness, because I'd never witnessed it before, except my own death with ayahuasca. But that was the first time I'd witnessed it with a client, and someone so young. And probably that brings up interesting ethical questions for everybody. A client in their teens, and the mother present, and also my husband was requested to be there again. So that's as close as I've gotten to it.
Well, let's laser in, and we'll ask Jules and Pikachu. Do you see any ethical concerns in the scenario that Tooth Fairy just mentioned, insofar as supporting a teen? And what is your ethics around that? What do you feel is appropriate? What do you feel might be too far out on the edge insofar as treating people who are not legally adults?
I think my answer is fairly simple, James, and for me, I don't work with minors with substances.
I think mine would be, I haven't. I mean, it's interesting too, because I think there's all these kind of layers of, ethical practice, but also, I think even just the three of us, we have different backgrounds, different levels of training, different, whether or not we're part of a sort of a governing body that, that we sort of don't talk about that stuff with sort of at the same time. So it's just really interesting having your own level of ethics and what's right. And I think too, there's also the world of if somebody's kind of a like a mature minor, and if they have the full ability to make decisions around their own care, and if family members supporting it. Because really, unless you're doing the work through clinical trials or through some other really above board way, all the stuff that we're doing around this medicine work is there's still prohibition, right? So there's I think those levels of just knowing that people have their own decisions around what's right and what feels right, and I think that's a lot of talk about that a lot, kind of in the underground therapist world, is the balance between risk and reward, not just for the clients and what's okay, and but also for us as individuals around making decisions or taking people on. And does it feel right? Does it feel like the person can if something happened and let's say the shit hit the fan, will that person have enough sort of trust in what you're doing as a professional, and that they wouldn't look at kind of raking you over the coals in whatever way, shape, or form that could be. So I think that's a question that's on everybody's minds all the time, just around those risks and safety. But I think people make their own decisions, and just making sure that I think that one of the biggest things is when you have sort of an ethical dilemma, do you have some kind of a process in place to be able to make sure that you're going through different steps to kind of consider all the angles? And one of the things that I'm a huge fan of is making sure that we have networks and people to consult with, because oftentimes people are doing this work in isolation and just really needing to make sure that we run things by each other or by our mentors or by our kind of co-therapists or whatever too, because that absolutely has to happen, especially with the angle of this still not being, there's no regulation around this work, right? And I think people that are considering either having a session done or they're looking at this as a profession, that those pieces are constantly being thrown around what's right and what's not, and guidelines and things like that too. So to really do your homework around how someone makes decisions and kind of where the yeses and the nos are in a really area that's often fraught with grayness.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have a clinical supervisor for this work, and I also have mentors that I can check in with. And I agree. We all have to hold ourselves to our own ethical accountability in how we work. I think I could see myself working with minors from a harm reduction kind of perspective. If I was working with a teen who was going to take the psychedelic anyway, and to at least provide a safe environment setting for that minor to work. And also I like the idea too, theory of having the parent involved. I think that's a really interesting possibility as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, what this miner did say, he said, I could never in a million years imagine working with this medicine outside of this situation. He says, I will never touch this outside of a therapeutic environment. That's how important it was to him. And it took me a year to decide. His mother had been asking me for a year, and we had him in the consultation. And Pikachu, you had said something really important. When Pikachu and I were working with a client presenting with bipolar, had an episode 2 years ago, he had said, how young is too young to work with this? And Pikachu, you said, well, someone can come in who's 50 years old and not ready to work with the medicine, and you can have a 15-year-old come in and really prepared to work with the medicine. I mean, not all, I would say less so, because there's a certain age at which it's difficult for young adults to make deep connections, and yet I'd spoken to a colleague of mine, a famous Canadian doctor, and I told him about this, and I spoke to him with permission to sort of speak. It's a mutual client of ours, and he said this boy did the kind of work that none of us could do under the medicine. He was blown away by the work he did because his mind was very open to it, and it wasn't, we can become very, very our circuits can get very tight and fused the older we get, and it's harder to get in there. There's a benefit of being more mature to be able to integrate things, but there's also benefit of neuroplasticity at a younger age. So, and then again, it's really, really important after the session is to be really clear with clients, especially with MDMA, is please do not smoke pot for at least a month, because that can interfere with your processing. I've noticed clients that have, gone away and they've smoked a joint in the evening and their processing changes, and it's hard. I mean, that's the thing. You make agreements. It doesn't mean people are going to keep them. So that's another part of this whole subject that's important to speak about. There's only so much you can regulate and control. You have agreements, but people break agreements. So it's another fascinating part of this.
I definitely feel like, excuse me, I'll edit that out. Pikachu, unless you really need to speak to that, and please do, we only have about 15 minutes left,
Yep.
And I have
Good.
and there's so many amazing places that we can go. Each of you is such a wealth of experience and knowledge, and what has come is what's here now. And before we go, I feel like we would all be at a loss if I didn't ask you about what your practices are, and what your suggestions are for your clients insofar as integration. And generally, but also in particular I want you to speak generally, and if you have something to add, I'd love an addition to how you support people in integrating, we'll say, large spiritual type experiences when they don't have a religious or spiritual foundation prior to that experience.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in here. A lot of the people that I see have, I see for integration reasons, just because, they go down, maybe they've had an experience. It could be, locally in their city of origin, or they go down to, somewhere in South America and have an ayahuasca experience or something like that, and they need to sort of unpack it when they get back. And I think, integration is interesting because, when I ask people, like, so what are we going to do for integration? It's like, well, it depends. Like, it totally depends on what's come up for you in the session, kind of how it went, what you were open to, if it was, a really big sort of spiritual. Oh. Okay. I'll just keep going here. If it was something that was, a new experience that they were trying to understand, or if it was something that was like a really personal kind of a piece, like something with their own lived experience, family experience, something like that. And a big part of the integration is, what are you gonna do with this going forward? If there's particular changes that you have to make, reminders of how you want to live your life. Maybe it's something to do with, like, your health, or your particular choices of how you deal with your body, or maybe it's connections around your relationships. You need to go and speak to somebody that you haven't spoken to for a while, or something, a change you want to make in the world. So it's so personal, and the whole idea of it is what's sort of the wisdom, either your own innate wisdom, your kind of inner teacher, inner healer, or if you have a belief in some sort of spiritual sort of facet of the plant as teacher, or universal understanding, or something like that. So that's kind of a big one. So knowing too that integration doesn't just happen the week after or a month after. It can be years afterwards, and just knowing that it's a really and it's not a linear process. It can be kind of nebulous too, and sometimes it's the way that something sort of sits in someone around how they kind of embody, something around themselves, or like regulation or something like that. And other times it's, specific goals that can be made. I think another thing too is, oftentimes when people come away from a really profound experience, whether medicinal or not, there's the idea of, I have to do all these things. I got like all this information, and sometimes it's just helping people kind of manage some of those. Maybe you don't have to change your whole life overnight, and like, let's be realistic and just be gentle with yourself. Like, give yourself some time to kind of digest it and process it, and this kind of evolving relationship with the information that can come out. So that's kind of my perspective on integration.
Yeah, I believe that integration is so important. It's at least, in my mind, 80% of what people get out of the whole experience. I always follow up with at least one integration phone call 2 to 3 days after the session, and that's an hour. And then I also invite them, if they want more integration sessions. Certainly, we can book that. In terms of integration, I sort of put out 3 general areas that they can think about. One is their work, or in their career, their creativity, if they're involved in producing things, how is that going to change? How does this session maybe change that? Second area is relationships. So did things come up that they want to change in their relationships? And then the third area is spirituality, meaning, significance. And for all those 3, I always like to bring the integration questions down to the how question. How are you, I think, Mother Teresa said, start today, use what you've got, work with the people in front of you. So that's often what I'll put out there is, if you were going to start today to make some changes that have come out of this session, what would that look like? So that's that really coming down to earth, really grounding into everyday life. Are we going to be better people because of what has happened here?
So, for me, when I work with clients in integration, it takes on many different forms. For sure, there's always the session the day after the medicine session. That's necessary. I invite clients to write to me. I invite clients to text me. If they need a short message, I will have phone calls with clients. For me, again, it's fluid. It's different with each client. And embodiment is really, really important, how to embody this lived experience, because I remind clients that what happened together is a lived experience. And in the integration session, if they hit upon a sense of, oh wow, I've never felt relaxed in front of another human being, I'm going to say to them, can you recall that feeling, what that feels like, and can we stop for a moment? And can you take that into your body to feel that again? What we're doing here is we're creating new neural circuits, and I tell them that's so important. This is neuroplasticity. This is a new circuit. So that's really important, how to bring it into the body. I will repeat that many times with clients. One of the greatest pieces of information that one of my great mentors told me, she's passed away now, but she moved her little finger like this, just imperceptibly, tiny, tiny, tiny bit. She says it takes more neural activity to do this than this. And I always remembered that. So if a client can go out with one small window of opening, that to me is gold. And if they can notice, and I'll say to them, notice, just keep noticing how you're experiencing yourself in the world. Keep noticing how you're experiencing other people. That to me is gold. And I really try to manage expectations, because a lot of people will afterwards say, how come this hasn't changed or that hasn't changed? And I've had 2 people actually say, why didn't I experience ecstasy with the MDMA? And I say, because you weren't at a party. I said, we were here to work on your relational trauma, right? And I actually just got that text right before this. She was asking why didn't she experience ecstasy, and I said that's why, because that wasn't the purpose. So she's still integrating that, and she goes, can you remind me what? Can you revisit this? Remind me what we were revisiting? And I said it was your relational trauma. So that's really important to me, to really validate for people that every small experience is so important on the neural level. And one of the things that Gabor Mate said at the ayahuasca retreat, which again is so invaluable, is the mind will try to invalidate our experience. It will always try to invalidate our experience. So I will tell people, your mind at one point may question what happened, and if it had any validity, that can happen. So watch your mind, notice it. And with different people, I'll encourage different encourage, again, it's an invitation to perhaps do Tai Chi or Qigong or restorative yoga. Music, we haven't mentioned music. Music plays a really big part both in the sessions for me and for integration. Sometimes I'll notice that there's a little piece that's hanging from the medicine session in the integration day, and I might pick a very important piece of classical music which I know stirs at the heartstrings. So it'll be about, let's bring our sadness back. Let's actually feel the sadness and bring it back to the heart level so we can process it together. So those are just some of my ideas around integration.
Beautiful. Please go ahead, Jules.
I think we've all spoken to this about the importance of integration being subverbal. That it doesn't have to just be talking, that it can be movement or art. That's something that I like to do, to people make images of what happened for them, that we're working at some deep levels that are maybe below the verbal kinds of understandings of what happened.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
I just want to add one really quick thing too. I think, finding if they're going to be able to have some kind of meaningful integration, it's like if they can have an experience, and this could be or any life experience where we get to step outside of what we think we know, and being able to say, wait a sec, I proceeded through my life and I had to kind of adjust and protect myself or learn how to be in the world because of all these things that happen. But wait a sec, what if that's like I got tricked and that sort of kept me, from living the full life that I wanted to. And when people can go, well, what if I could have sort of, a number of options open to me? What if the way that I thought I was before isn't really actually, maybe that's a limitation? I think then it's like now you can integrate into so many possibilities that could be open for the future because you're not sort of hampered and kind of bogged down by things of the past. So I have those kind of conversations with people often because sometimes we don't even realize that we're kind of in a particular structure that affects our ability to take things on or look at things in a different way until we get out of ourselves and then come back into ourselves again.
One last sentence. I know you're about to say something, James, but people always say, well, it's not the experience I wanted. And I say, the experience you are having is what's being revealed to you. And how can we be with the experience that's being revealed to us? Mm-hmm.
Well, there are so many things, it's almost like we just went through an iceberg field today, if that makes any sense. And we saw some really great ice formations, but barely scratched the surface of what's actually in the water there. And maybe, reality willing, there will be another time that we'll be able to go deeper. But as it stands, I want to thank each of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to come and share your wisdom and your experience here with us at Adventures to the Mind, and also for doing what you're doing despite the draconian limitations that have been placed on the medicines that we have spoke so positively about today.
James, thank you for creating interest and holding space for this conversation in such a beautiful way.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks for your work, James.
Cheers. Extra thanks to Jules, who was the initiator of this whole idea. We would not have come together if she had not brought it up. So
fantastic.
Thanks everyone. It's really great listening to all of you, and I always learn something, coming together with other people like this.
Okay, and cut. Well, thank you very much for tuning in for this episode of Adventures Through the Mind, the first anonymous episode, and perhaps not the last. There's a couple coming up in the interview pipeline or future interview pipeline with some other people who choose to remain anonymous because of the things that they do in this world, but would like to be public as well, in some sense that their work is public, although their face and name and home address are not public. Anyways, thank you very much for tuning in. Now, due to the legal complexities, I'm going to ask you to please not email me and ask me to connect you with these three people. Their identities are something that I intend to protect, and it puts everyone in a strange legal predicament to start, pushing those contacts around. So I'm going to ask you not to reach out to me to get in contact with any of them. However, if you are looking for some integration coaching, this is something that I do provide, and I would be happy to help you in that regards. Info to that will be found in a link in the description to this episode, or you could just look it up on jameswjesso.com. Finally, that's it. Thanks for sharing this. Thanks for donating to the podcast in some sense or another, be it Patreon or by buying a t-shirt, what have you, by going to jameswjesso.com/support or checking out the links that are contained in the description to this episode. Oh, it is, a rainy, gray day, and I'm feeling good, but I'm also feeling very, very relaxed as a consequence of getting quite a wonderful cannabis extracts vaporizer for Christmas and making good use of it last night. But that's it. Thank you for tuning in, and I will see y'all on the next episode of Adventures Through the Mind. Take care.